Hey, RetconRaider here, and welcome back to the second half of the Fallout Van Buren Companion Overview. Last time we talked about the 8 human companions that were going to be included in Van Buren, Interplay's cancelled version of Fallout 3. So this time we'll be taking a closer look at the 8 non-human companions that the game also would have had to offer. Let's start off with one we know the most about, Bear. One of 2 Super Mutant companions planned for the game, Bear is a prominent part of the Bloomfield Space Center design document. Toward the late stages of the main storyline, the player would have to travel to the Bloomfield Space Center, but when they arrived, they would find various obstacles blocking their way. The first of these obstacles would have been a raider gang known as the Rusty Hooks, led by Kyle the Hook and his trusty Super Mutant bodyguard, Bear. Although the player could simply approach the situation with overwhelming firepower and slaughter the Rusty Hooks, a more diplomatic approach would quickly reveal some oddities about the gang's power structure. Although Kyle was the undisputed leader of the gang, many of his followers seemed to consider Bear as the real brains of the operation. Further investigation would reveal that Bear wasn't just mindless muscle. In fact, he was a former member of the Master's Army, and one of the few super mutants to still retain his pre-mutation intellect. Delving into Bear's backstory would turn up some very interesting information. Apparently, Bear had been a caravan guard on one of the first caravans the gang had ever attacked, and the mutant had managed to kill 6 of the raiders before they managed to bring him down. The gang took him prisoner, and when the mutant recovered, he immediately swore loyalty to Kyle the Hook. Further investigation would eventually reveal that, while he had been recovering, Bear was implanted with an explosive device to ensure his loyalty to the gang's leader. So this would present the player with a fairly simple means of neutralizing the Rusty Hooks. They could either find a way to neutralize the bomb, allowing Bear to take control of the gang, or they could take over the gang themselves. Either way, they could potentially end up with Bear as a companion, either by securing his loyalty by granting him freedom, or by claiming the detonator from Kyle the Hook and using it to demand Bear's loyalty. As a companion, Bear was very powerful, with above-average special attributes, the Gifted and Bruiser traits, the Action Boy, More Criticals, and Tag perks, and a heavy focus on unarmed melee weapons, firearms, and persuasion skills. He would also be equipped with a custom suit of super mutant-sized armor, and the weapon that gave him his namesake, the Bear Claw Fist, a metal gauntlet fitted with a spring-loaded bear trap. Unfortunately, although he makes for a very solid companion, Bear did have a few significant drawbacks. First, Bear would only be encountered in a late-game area, meaning that the player would most likely be drawing close to the end of the game by the time they met him. Second, if the player didn't find a way to completely disable the bomb in Bear's chest, then certain types of damage, such as electricity, would have a chance of detonating the C4 charge and instantly killing him. For players intent on recruiting a super mutant companion, Beatrice might have been a simpler alternative. Far less intelligent than Bear, Beatrice didn't really remember where she came from, but she knew she liked to kill and eat people, so that made her an ideal enforcer. When she stumbled into the settlement at Hoover Dam, she was met with fear and hostility until she met Dusty Hart. Ever the opportunist, Dusty manipulated Beatrice with acts of kindness, securing her loyalty as a personal bodyguard and as the bouncer for her establishment, Dusty's Desires. This is where the player would first meet her. Shortly after encountering her for the first time, the player would see her being attacked by a small group of angry locals, armed with cattle prods and a super sledge. If the player intervened on her behalf, and survived the ensuing brawl, then Beatrice would swear her undying loyalty to them. Accepting her loyalty would grant the player a new companion, but would also anger her previous employer, hurting the player's reputation in Hoover Dam, and prompting Dusty to increase her prices when dealing with the player in the future. Statistically, Beatrice was a fairly solid combat companion with above-average physical attributes and a focus on the melee, firearms, and unarmed skills. But beyond that, she didn't bring much else to the table. Her story involvement appeared to be minimal, though it's possible that her presence as a companion might have influenced some interactions with characters who disliked mutants. She was ultimately a simple, straightforward companion who was relatively easy to recruit, making her an ideal meat shield for less combat-oriented player characters. Another potential companion in Hoover Dam was Otto Steed, a ghoul who served as the chief engineer of the downtown district. An exile from the reservation, more on that in a moment, he's now the only ghoul in town, where his unique mechanical skills have been put to good use, maintaining some of the settlement's most important machinery. The player would of course encounter him in the downtown district of the Hoover Dam settlement. If the player interacted with him, Otto would make it clear that he was currently focused on improving the settlement's water filtration system, which would open up a new side quest for the player to pursue. If the player could retrieve appropriate schematics for Otto, or directly improve the water filtration system with their own skills, then Otto would be grateful. So grateful, in fact, that he would ask to tag along with the player on their travels, in hopes of discovering other mechanical wonders that might be hidden out in the wastelands. Statistically, Otto had fairly solid attributes that lent him toward a hit-and-run combat style. His skills were focused on mechanics, firearms, and sneaking, and he possessed a unique perk called Living Tool Set, which allowed him to make mechanics skill checks without needing a toolkit in his inventory. This was apparently intended to represent his habit of attaching or embedding tools in his own body, and the design documents even mention that the writer had made a special request to the art department for a special ghoul head texture with things like bolts and tools embedded in the skull. From a story standpoint, there's not much written about poor Otto, but what little we do know makes it obvious that he was supposed to have some close ties with the Ghoul Run reservation. If the game had been completed, he would have presumably had some unique interactions with the NPCs at that location. And speaking of the reservation, that brings us to our second ghoulish companion, Measles. I'll be talking about the reservation in another video, but suffice to say that it's home to a group of ghoul extremists who are attempting to find a way to advance their own species. Measles is one of their success stories. Where most ghouls are the result of a unique combination of exposure to FEV and hard radiation, Measles is one of the very few examples of a natural-born ghoul. Visually, Measles would have seemed weak and frail, but this would have been a deliberate deception. Unlike most ghouls, he was surprisingly fit and capable, with traits such as gifted and finesse, and attributes such as Action Boy, more criticals, and a unique perk called Bonsai. He would have favored stealth and sneak attacks, and his mastery of deception would have made it difficult to discern if he ever had any real loyalty to the player. In fact, he would only accompany the player if ordered to do so by the leader of the reservation, a ghoul supremacist named Willem Clark. Although he would openly voice his hatred of humans, he would accompany the player with the understanding that he wanted to learn about the other settlements in the area, and to ostensibly establish a trade network with them. But in truth, once the rail network was established, Willem Clark would have used it to instead start bombing those other settlements with crude nuclear weapons, so that only ghouls would be left to rule the wastelands. And if the player objected, well, Measles wouldn't hesitate to critically stab them right in the back. Another companion with a potentially conflicting agenda would be Brain in a Jar, or Badjar for short. Badjar would have been encountered in Boulder Dome as a brilliant scientist who just happened to also be a disembodied brain kept alive by machinery. He would have been part of the Think Tank, a group of similarly disembodied brains who were used as living wetware to help with Victor Presper's work. Similar to Skynet from Fallout 2, Badjar would have been a potential candidate for transplant into a robo-brain body, which would have allowed him to join the player as a companion. As a companion, Badjar would have had exceptional science skills, which he could have theoretically turned toward using the facilities at Boulder Dome to craft and repair equipment, or to research a potential cure for the new plague. This would be offset by his socially awkward and occasionally glitchy behavior, caused by his centuries of life as a disembodied brain. From a story standpoint, he would obviously be tied into the overarching story of the Boulder Dome location, including Victor Presper's grand plan. Recruiting him would require that the player resolve the Boulder Dome questline in certain ways, preferably using diplomacy rather than violence, and it was mentioned in the design documents that Badjar would automatically become hostile if the player did anything to hurt the other brains in the think tank. And that brings us to the more trustworthy, programmable companions, the robots. There were 3 potential robotic companions in Fallout Van Buren, each of them fairly light on story, but heavy on utility. First, there was Job, a broken-down Mr. Handy robot that the player could encounter in the ruins of Denver. Job could be found in the old police department building, where he once worked as the records keeper. Although long since broken down, a player with the appropriate parts and skills could repair Job, using him as a source of information around Denver, and potentially pointing the player towards a secret cache of goods in the police chief's private bomb shelter. Alternatively, the player could instead opt to just strip Job for parts, repurposing those ingredients towards other crafting projects. As a companion, Job would have been almost entirely useless in combat, being both slow and easy to hit, but he would have had an advanced sensor system that would have made him adept at spotting stealthed enemies and electronic traps. His programming would have prevented him from leaving the Denver region, but a player with the right skills or perks would have been able to remove that restriction. Another possible robotic recruit in Denver was the CRB-S, or Cerberus. A lot more impressive than a glitchy Mr. Handy, the Cerberus was a pre-war prototype used by the Denver City Police Department prior to the Great War. There were 3 in total, and initially they serve as secondary antagonists reactivated remotely by the Odysseus AI to track and detain the player when he first arrives in Denver. The CRB-S robots were massive, dog-like machines designed to help deal with the protests that sprang up in the final days of the Old World. They were equipped with specialized, non-lethal weapon systems such as tear gas grenades, flash grenades, water cannons, foam cannons, and shock attacks. While they would initially be hostile to the players, it was possible for a clever and resourceful player to find their way to the Cerberus Command Center in the ruins of the Denver Police Department. There, the player would be able to reprogram one of the robots, turning it into an asset or even a temporary companion. Unfortunately, the Cerberus units would be inherently limited in range, and their recharge requirements would prevent them from accompanying the player beyond Denver. And that brings us to the final companion in the game. Well, literally speaking, because you only encountered him during the final part of the game. Security and Operations Robot 1000 Alpha, or Alpha for short. This potential companion would only be encountered after the player had already successfully infiltrated Bomb 1. Originally built to patrol the living quarters of the satellite, Alpha slowly developed self-awareness in his centuries of solitude after the Great War. He spent his many years of solitude studying the events that had led up to the end of the world, and he used the equipment on the satellite to monitor the planet below, growing inspired as he watched humanity slowly rebuild. When Victor Presper and his men arrived on the satellite, Alpha objected to Presper's plan, which prompted the scientist to shut him down. When the player arrives, he can reactivate Alpha, potentially gaining an invaluable ally against Presper. Although damaged during his confrontation with Presper, a technologically capable player would be able to restore several of Alpha's damaged systems, making him a more and more formidable asset in the game's final battle. Given his nature, Alpha would also be uniquely suited to handle several tasks that the player might otherwise have difficulty accomplishing. But Alpha would only assist the player if he agreed to help with not only stopping Presper, but also destroying the satellite, so that no one else could ever try to use it again. And that brings us to the actual final companion on our list, the Devil Dog. Perhaps filling in for the iconic dog meat role, this canine companion would have been encountered in Hangdog Village. Unnaturally powerful and aggressive, he was both feared and admired by the local tribals, who worried that he was possessed by an evil spirit, but also wished to use him as breeding stock in hopes of passing on his strength to future litters. In truth, the devil dog was infected with a mutated version of rabies, which a properly skilled player could diagnose and treat. Regardless of whether the player treated the disease or not, it would be possible to tame the devil dog with the outdoorsman skill. Once tamed, the player could either keep the dog as a companion or hand it over to the hangdog tribe. If the player opted to not treat the dog, then it would be an effective ally in combat, but it would slowly grow sicker and sicker with the passage of time, eventually dying. If the player did cure the dog, then it would still serve as a potential companion, but it would be much less capable in combat, and the tribals would lose most of their interest in it. And that covers pretty much everyone. All 16 of the potential companions that would have been featured in Van Buren. Although many of them are interesting on an individual basis, the most notable feature of all these potential companions was how intrinsically tied they were to the various events and locations they were encountered in, further reinforcing the sense of reactivity as well as choice and consequence that would have been heavily featured in Van Buren. But we'll get into that with some of my upcoming videos, where I'll start talking about the specific location design documents. So for now, this is RetconRaider signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, while I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, and the Fallout franchise in general, you can check out all 700 pages of the Van Buren design documents yourself by visiting the Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.